welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you're listening to a weekly podcast about books and life, not necessarily in that order. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at Facebook.com/Virtual Memories Show, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube by searching for Virtual Memories Show. We're also on tunein.com. Also, just search for Virtual Memories Show or Gil Roth. And if you like this podcast, please go to the iTunes store, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and review for us. Maybe that'll inspire Apple to promote us a little in the new year. You can support the Virtual Memories Show and get access to exclusive content with a recurring monthly donation via Patreon. Just visit patreon.com/VMSpod and set up your level of support. You'll get new material from our patron-only blog, and you'll also get to listen to my quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet, which features extra material from our guests and is only available to supporters of the show. So visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. Now, I spent the weekend prepping for podcasts, recording podcasts, editing podcasts, and cleaning the downstairs bathroom in case Sunday's podcast guest wanted to use the John. She didn't, but now I've got a clean bathroom, so hey. I did manage to skip all but the last 75 seconds of the Super Bowl, which was great, because that meant the minute plus I did watch was super tense. And I didn't watch long enough to see anyone suffer traumatic brain injury. It's a little things. Also, the other one thing that's going on in my life, I have a little anniversary to celebrate. Today is 15 years since I launched Virtual Memories as a blog. That's sort of the precursor to this podcast back when blogging was, a thing. I've done very little of that sort of writing since I got the show going for a variety of reasons. Time, nothing to say, having even less of a reading audience than I once had, especially with the social media microblogging era. Blogs have sort of fallen off by the wayside. I do sort of miss that kind of writing, but, if I've got to pick and choose my spots, I'd rather have this, Still, 15 years is something. I mean, it's not 255 years, which is what this week's guest is surveying, but hey. My guest is Henry Wessells this week. Henry has a new book called A Conversation Larger Than the Universe, Readings in Science Fiction and the Fantastic, 1762 to 2017, published by Oak Knoll Press. It accompanies Henry's exhibition at the Grolier Club in New York City, which runs until March 10th, 2018. And shows off 70 or so pieces from Henry's collection. See, Henry's a writer and a deep reader of science fiction and an antiquarian book dealer. And this exhibition uses a bunch of his pieces to illustrate the history of science fiction from its Gothic roots through today. The book itself is a wonderful exploration of that history, shows off a lot of the items in the collection, but also goes beyond what's there into Henry's notions of what science fiction says about human history and our literary cultures and our extrapolations of ourselves and the world as we're coming to understand it. It's just an illuminating book and a wonderful exhibition. Now, my history with Henry is I saw him a few times at ReaderCon, that literary science fiction festival in Massachusetts in summer, where I've done a whole bunch of shows in the past. And he was always the other well-dressed guy at that event. And for that reason, I never really went over to talk to him. I guess there's some weird enmity around that I had. I don't know. But when I saw him at the Antiquarian Book Fair a year or two back, I thought, I know that guy from somewhere, and had to keep going and going. I knew it was around books. It wasn't a comics thing. Eventually it hit me. This was the guy from ReaderCon. So I struck up a conversation with him. We had a nice shooting of the breeze, and I pitched him on recording. And he told me at the time he'd rather wait a year plus until the exhibition was running and the book was out. And now that I've been to the club and seen it, now that I've read the book, I really understand why. This conversation larger than the universe is a project of deep passion. And if we talked while Henry was still in the midst of it, in the midst of writing it, and I think he knew what the pieces were for the collection, but hadn't written all the chapters for the book yet, I don't think he'd have had nearly as much to say, or that it would have been as meaningful now that it's all come together into this amazing collection and book. If you're a reader of, we'll say, fantastic literature, or fantastica, as past podcast John Clute would put it, but you can't make it to the Grolier Club before March 10th, do yourself a favor, order this book, either through grolierclub.org or the Oak Knoll Press website, which is oakknoll.com. The book features a lovely introduction by another past podcast, John Crowley. It's really wonderful. I'm really glad I'm glad to experience this, and I'm glad Henry and I got to sit down now that the exhibition is up and he can breathe a little bit. Now here's a bio of Henry. It's from the Oak Knoll website. There are more entertaining bios of him out there, including from his main website, endlessbookshelf.net. Henry Wessells is an antiquarian bookseller in New York City and author of Another Green World, 2003, and Extended Range, 2015. A frequent contributor to the New York Review of Science Fiction, his work has appeared in Nature, Lady Churchill's Rosebud Wristlet, Wormwood, Interzone, the Washington Post Book World, and other publications. He is also editor and bibliographer of American science fiction writer Avram Davidson. His new book is A Conversation Larger Than the Universe, Readings in Science Fiction and the Fantastic, 1762 to 2017. And now, the Virtual Memories Conversation with Henry Wessells. Tell me about the exhibition and the collection, the book that goes with it, A Conversation Larger Than the Universe. Where did the exhibition begin for you? What was the process like?
This is a project that I've been working on for either 3 years or since I was 7 years old, because one of the first things that a visitor to the exhibition will see is my 7-year-old signature in a copy of the first Doc Savage paperback. And that's where it started for me. Once I understood that I could read everything in the school library, I did, and then I moved on to reading grown-up books. And my father must have been a buyer of the Bantam paperbacks of the Doc Savage reprints, because he told me sometime later that his collection of pulp magazines perished when the barn in Vermont blew over in the thunderstorm in 1948. He would have been in his early 20s then. I guess that's a variation on the story of my mother threw them out.
Yeah,
but
like all of our comic books.
I've been reading Doc Savage and fantastical literature since my earliest age, and this collection, this exhibition, is the fruit of some of my reading over the past many years. I don't define science fiction. I describe science fiction very broadly to include what some people might see as core science fiction, but I also like to think about the fantastic, broadly sketched, and even horror and more dark things that aren't traditional science fiction. John Clute uses the expression fantastica. That comes easily off of his tongue. I use science fiction in much the same way. So the exhibition came about when 4 years ago I finally decided that I would propose an exhibition to the Grolier Club based on my own collection and my own reading interests. And they said yes. This is the first time they've ever had an exhibition of science fiction in the 130-plus year history of the club in New York. And I'm very happy to have been the one to bring all these great things into the club and display them. I have adopted a somewhat chronological approach to the exhibition and to my interests because I see science fiction as arising out of the Gothic. For me, the key text is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which was published 200 years ago. And that is where a brilliant young teenager finds a way to make it new. The Gothic had been around since the early 1760s. Everybody in Europe and America who was reading fiction was reading Gothic novels, either sentimental ones, historical fiction that later led to Maria Edgeworth and Sir Walter Scott, or else the supernatural Gothic. It's all right there at the beginning in the first Gothic novel, published in 1762 by Thomas Leland. The title is Longsword, and it is set in the 13th century. The title page talks about it being an historical tale, and there's a bit of a hoopla about the using historical sources. But it is a Gothic adventure, shipwreck, false imprisonment, ruined castles, evil monks, damsels in distress, and impossible coincidences that even Dickens would have hesitated to use. All that right there in 1762 in the first Gothic novel, which was published before the Gothic phenomenon even had a name. It was only with the second edition of The Castle of Otranto in 1765 that books began calling themselves Gothic tales. The first edition of The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole was published anonymously and simply called itself a historical tale, or translated from an old manuscript. I don't have the title page in front of me. But 50 years on, the form had been beaten to death, and along came Mary Shelley and made it new. She had a scientist working in isolation to invent an artificial human being, not an automaton, as many 18th century French novels seem to encounter, but a human being capable of learning language and of thinking for himself and looking around at the world. And if that isn't new, I don't know what is. So I start from the Gothic, go through with Frankenstein and other texts from the period that I am interested in writing about and thinking about. I touch on imaginary voyages because that's another place that feeds into form that feeds into science fiction. Le Nagzag, a French novel from the early 1770s, is an imaginary voyage. It's also an imaginary drug novel. And I think that that's worthy of including under the big umbrella of science fiction.
Yeah, I did have the experience reading the book and seeing the exhibition of but thinking how great it would be if you slipped imaginary books into the into the catalog, as it were.
The first time that
in a sort of Borgesian way.
The first time I wrote something and sent on a draft of my checklist of Avram Davidson. This was 20 years ago, more. I gave it to a writer friend who asked, "Is Avram Davidson imaginary?" So I would be But it would be tough to pull that off in a society devoted to bibliophilia and bibliography like the Grolier Club. So these books all exist, and they are from copies illustrated from the copies on my own shelves. I don't have too much Jules Verne in my collection because I read them as a teenager in France in a big long row of paperbacks published in the J'ai Lu series, and they're long gone. I never kept them. And there are other books like that I read in my childhood that are not represented in this exhibition, or they're only alluded to in passing in the book because I never collected them, and I didn't go quite as deeply into some of the canonical authors of science fiction because it's the blurry edges that interest me, where you wonder which side of the line you're on between the fantastic and the world, our own world, or what Lord Dunsany called the fields we know.
Yeah, where did the collecting impulse begin for you? And I know you, before we started recording, you said you're not a collector.
Well, no, I tell myself that I'm a working writer, and I am interested in books as they were originally published and thinking about the context in which they were published. I am clearly enough of a collector to have accumulated a few books, but many of the books that are on my shelves are books written by friends and things that I as a reader and thinker about the fantastic, they're books I need to have. It is while putting together this exhibition that I saw that there was perhaps more coherence to my collecting.
Yeah, I was going to ask, did you realize there were patterns to what you were?
Yes, and my brother, I would say, really inherited my father's collecting impulse. He was the one who saved the boxes for his toy cars as a child, and he may still have those. But our father was a serious motoring enthusiast and a collector of Alfa Romeos and many other things. But so
did you ever go to that there was that antique sports car place in Nyack up on the Hudson back when I was a kid?
Oh,
there was a great place.
There was an auction in Tarrytown usually.
Yeah, this is the other side of the Hudson. Yeah, I used to buy comics, of course, at M&M in Nyack, and then go for a walk and look at these amazing speedboats and sports cars.
I grew up outside of Philadelphia and later in France, so I'm a comparative newcomer to the Hudson River Valley. We've been here since 1987.
Okay.
So I'm from New Jersey now, as I tell people.
And they ask what exit, and we won't tell anyone. But but your father's sports cars and other. So
there is. I understand what a collector is. Back in the early '90s, when I first began reading Avram Davidson and trying to find more books to read, I might have thought that I was a collector. And then I went to work for A.B. Bookman's Weekly, which was a trade journal for antiquarian books. And I started meeting people who really were collectors. and then eventually that magazine folded after the internet, and I jumped the fence from writing a sports column to playing baseball, and I met people really who were collectors. Somebody once said to me that you're not a collector until you have 10,000 books. So this is a very small house where this is being recorded, and I do not have 10,000 books.
Yeah, I was wondering when I got here whether there were sub-basements, if you drilled a few floors below to...
No.
Good.
The core of my writing for the last many years is right now on the shelves and walls of the Grolier Club. These books are how I've written about it. Some pieces are some books in the exhibition are new friends. Others are books that I've read in my teenage years and then picked up again and found I remembered much more of them and was much more influenced by them than I had known consciously. I'm thinking specifically about a French novel from 1919, L'Atlantide or Atlantida, which is about the Sahara discovered in the middle of the Sahara, the mountains of the Sahara in southern Algeria. This is when the French were just beginning to explore, and there were still some blank spaces on the map. But the Queen of Atlantis had a very nice library with up-to-date periodicals from metropolitan France, and a library from a librarian who came from one of the French learned societies. And that combination of exotic and fantastical and the lore of the Arab world, that was something that followed me into my adulthood and into my university training. I studied Arabic as a college student, went over to Egypt on a fellowship, and at that point I decided I didn't want to go into government work or academia, and I have always kept up the interest in Arabic and the language skills, but I've never worked formally in that area, and that's why I'm an antiquarian bookseller and a writer now rather than something else.
Besides Arabic and French and English,
I read German and have some speaking knowledge of German, and that's about it.
So, have you read Mendel, the Bibliophile by Stefan Zweig, either in German or in English? Then
no,
you should probably watch out for that one.
Mendel, I will look for that.
Yeah.
That sounds fun.
Yeah, it's World War I.
Yes,
yeah.
So there's nothing like writing a book about the history of science fiction to realize how little of it one has read. There's a whole tradition of German and Russian science fiction about which I only know the tip of the iceberg, or the outermost parts of it, and that is not an area I collect. But French is one of is very close to my heart, and so I did want to have the Pierre Benoit Atlantide in view in the collection,
which again I thought was made up when I was reading the book. I was glad to see it actually existed when I got there, unless it's a clever facsimile all around.
No. Well, what's neat is the producing this book with a great designer. The copy of that book jumps off of the page of this of the conversation in the same way that it jumps out of the glass case. It's a pale yellow paperback book from 1919, but it reproduced really well, and so this is the book is the next best thing to actually coming to the club and looking at the things on there.
Yeah, I was happy to start reading it as a PDF, race to the Grolier Club last week to actually see the exhibition and buy the hard copy of the book, and then finish it in print, because it's
much more fun. I'm of the school that believes it's much more fun to read a book on paper.
Oh yeah,
and
I was very happy. That, as I started reading it, I thought, I should really have the book itself. I'd really like to make sure I can actually see everything as it represents on a real page. But tell me about your SF or science fiction history. I mean, you mentioned Doc Savage and the pulps when you were a kid, but at what point did you evolve? Because mine was like the stainless steel rat and the Galactic Midway, and it's a trashy science fiction.
I read H.P. Lovecraft in paperback as a teenager in France, because somehow one of the Panther paperbacks of the early 1970s turned up, and so H.P. Lovecraft, and that was, like many teenage readers, one becomes obsessive about it. It took many years and a good dose of the writings of Raymond Chandler to recover from the pernicious stylistic effects of reading too much H.P. Lovecraft. But I would say that I really first understood that science fiction was where I wanted to be when I rediscovered science fiction in my college years through Brian Eno. The first discovering the record Another Green World, and then what used to be called a multimedia album, a book and pictures of a Robert Sheckley story with music by Brian Eno, In a Land of Clear Colors. And Robert Sheckley is the funniest writer, and I've read pretty much everything he's written over the years, and he is what kept me interested in science fiction and drew me back into the books that I had some of them I had read, but his humor and his sense of humor and his down to earth nature that comes through some of the stories. That the section writing about Robert Sheckley was the hardest thing for me, because it's like, how do you describe the air you breathe, or the yard, the way you measure everything around you. But I am happy to say that I found a way to talk about it and perhaps convey and through the occasional quotation allude to what it is that makes Sheckley so appealing. Robert Sheckley's also the guy where Douglas Adams, the author of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, said Robert Sheckley's work is much better, much funnier than mine. And then Robert Sheckley retorted, "Yes, but Douglas Adams makes lots more money." So Robert Sheckley and reading the British New Wave and some of their American counterparts, J.G. Ballard, Tom Dish, and things like that. Sort of reading the books that were written just before I started, and Philip K. Dick, the works that were written just before I really became aware of science fiction, and then in 1993, in the spring of 1993, I picked up a paperback book at a local used bookshop called The Enquiries of Dr. Esterhazy by Avram Davidson. And reading that book, I understood that this was a writer I wanted to learn more about, that the way he mixed scholarship and wit and wide-ranging subject matter, it unlocked something. The light bulb went on for me. And at that point in the spring of 1993, there was two books in print by Avram Davidson. They were published by a small press in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania, called Owlswick. I found the phone number. I called up, and George Sithers answered the phone and said, when I asked if I could order the books, he said, "Avram Davidson died last week." And so I never knew him in person, but I met him through his work, and eventually, as one does, or one did in the days before the internet, you make a list of things to try and find where there's more material to read, where the short stories were published, where the books are, and this went on, and I guess through the Locus magazine and addresses in there, I met Michael Swanwick and later Grania Davis, and really became closely involved in trying to survey the work of Avram Davidson and help get it back into print after his death. Michael Swanwick is one of my oldest friends in science fiction, and very generous with his knowledge to a newcomer way back when I was coming in to the field.
Was he the first legit author you'd met?
No, I met Isaac Asimov in 1977 when my family was returning from France by way of Southampton on the QE2. Very famously, Isaac Asimov did not fly in airplanes. He gave a talk on the necessity to empower women, and that was the real revolution still waiting to happen. Mm-hmm. So I was 17, and I shook his hand, afterwards, and that was the first famous.
Okay.
But
Swanwick is the first friend,
first author who has become a friend, mm-hmm. I was very pleased that he and his wife were in the audience at the opening and the launch of the book last week.
Oh yeah, you mentioned it on Twitter. I saw. That's right.
So with reading and writing about Avram Davidson and eventually publishing, that's what drew me closer and closer into the world of science fiction. And then in the summer of 1995, I was working for a reference book publisher, and I went to a colleague who was on the tech side of things, and I said, I have all this information about Avram Davidson. Can you help me turn it into a database? What do I have to do? He said, let's build a website instead. I said, what's that? And so the Avram Davidson website, which is still very clunky and old-fashioned, but it's been around since the summer of 1995. Back in the days when you had to code on as a text editor, and I didn't even have a computer at home, so he would load these files and sort of show me what they looked like, and so on. But it sort of evolved a little bit.
And that essentially became the Avram Davidson Society?
Well, the Avram Davidson website then helped create the Avram Davidson Society and some print publications that it has done. And what better excuse to have a nice lunch with friends than to have a meeting of a literary society. So I guess that would have been about 1998 or 99. We began having those, and I'll probably this year will be 25 years since the death of Avram Davidson, and I have a little pamphlet that I will be producing just to mark that occasion, and to show that even though one has been reading and thinking about an author, there's still new things to discover. And I thought I had gone through everything from Avram's days as an editor of the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, but I just found something new that I had not read, and it's very its republication will be timely and of interest to perhaps a wider circle, because it connects Avram with a name in science fiction that is much more widely known than his, and you'll have to wait until May to find out what that is.
On tenterhooks.
It'll be fun. It's not always been about the fame. I mean, for me, it's the quality of the writing that's always motivated me as a reader, and I think that's why I discovered Avram Davidson and was not concerned about his
stature.
For his fame meant nothing, but the esteem in which writers held him, that was very telling. And the Treasury, the Avram Davidson Treasury, published in 1998, really testifies to the breadth of his friendship and the respect writers had for him. It's got everybody from Gregory Benford and William Gibson to fantasy writers, and I know that Guy Davenport was also a fan of Avram's late work.
There is a curse to being a writer's writer, as the guy who wrote the introduction to your book has told me on numerous podcasts. John Crowley, he said it's really not a compliment to be a writer's writer, but he'll live with it.
But I think to be a reader's writer is that's we all start as readers, and I guess I've known John Crowley through being a reader of Little Big, and then eventually meeting him at a ReaderCon, perhaps many years ago. And I have, we've kept in touch. And some years ago, when I first started thinking about putting the catalog, I said, "Would you write an introduction?" And he very graciously said yes. And then not only that, but delivered, on time, a wonderful thing which he called a hat full of adjectives. And there's a sentence in there that when I read it, I thought, wow, I wish I had written that, but at least he wrote it for my book. So
It's a cause of greatness in others. That's good.
It's great, and it's got centuries of English literature, the fantastic, and mirrors all in one sentence.
Yeah.
It's worth keeping an eye out for in there.
I do have one question here. How often do you reread Little Big? Which I notice is on the table right here.
On the table as we are speaking. That's a book that sometimes I have to be careful not to pull it down from the shelf to look up a reference or a thought, because I might just keep reading it. So last year, while writing my conversation, I had to tell myself, no, you can reread the Little Big when it's over, when it's done and the manuscript is done. And so I'm rereading
making up for lost time
with great pleasure, and it's
you give him his own chapter. You give him and it its own chapter in the book.
Yeah, yes, I do, because he did something that I don't think any other book has done. It works as a science fiction novel of a near future in which America is not the place that the politicians talk about, the great place. It's a very troubled country. Things don't work so well, and there's a tyrant. And being a child of the 70s and 80s, I thought that I had lived through the era of the tyrant. And yet, here it is. Science fiction is relevant it's always relevant to the present. And so Russell Eigenblick is a name that should be on everybody's lips in 2018. But it's also, Little Big is also a fantastic American love story. It's an homage to so many literary authors and to the act of reading and writing. Shakespeare with Midsummer Night's Dream. Lewis Carroll is everywhere through it. Thornton W. Burgess, because John Crowley is no literary snob either, and he knows how to bring all these things into a perfect book. It needs no sequel. It takes the reader and Smokey Barnable on this long journey, and it does it in writing that is it's perfect, because if it were any, it could be saccharine in the hands of a less skilled writer. It could be just it could be twee, but it isn't. Somehow he manages to just stay right on that razor edge of something that deals with touching subjects and beautiful subjects, but without going into a false sentimentality or anything. A great book, and on view in the exhibition and illustrated in the book is Tom Dish's copy of the proof of Little Big, because Tom Dish was a friend of John Crowley's for many, many years, and read the book in proof, and there's a wonderful inscription on it, and it's meaningful for me to think about books as people and as records of friendship. I knew Tom in the last couple of years of his life, and that's how I came to have his collection of John Crowley. He was selling off things and then placing his archive, and the Crowley I was interested enough to secure for myself. Tom Dish had some really interesting letters from Philip K. Dick and inscribed copies. That went into the book trade and to private collectors. But the John Crowley Association was meaningful to me as it was to Tom.
You have other good stories behind some of the acquisitions? I hate using the term acquisitions.
Well,
behind books in your
some. I mean, some of them are just looking for books that nobody is paying attention to. I have a copy of the Kula Press Selections from the Writings of Lord Dunsany from 1912, which was published by a an arts and crafts press in Dublin owned by Lily and Lolly Yeats, the sisters of the poet William Butler Yeats. They were printed, as I said, by village girls. But just looking for books, looking for a copy one day, there I found the copy owned by Lily Yeats, the founder of the press, with her bookplate designed by her brother, the artist Jack B. Yeats. That it wasn't expensive. It was just nobody understood it in the way I did, as representing a connection between the fantastical and high literature. They're never that far apart.
Yeah. I think you mentioned in the book, you have that line that literature never excluded science fiction until it excluded itself.
Yeah, that's a little mischievous, because I do feel that sometimes the influence of the pulp magazines was not always to the good of literature. I mean, that was how one of the ways in which American science fiction developed, but the quality of the writing is not necessarily why one goes, and that's still is it's the blessing and the curse of science fiction at the same time. But so that's what I mean about the science fiction excluding itself from literature. And some people try to wear that as a badge of honor, and that's life's too short to do that. I think good writing or great writing and great ideas are what it's about. And I think science fiction and the fantastic has a lot more of them than people credit it for. It's with people like Tom Dish and J.G. Ballard in the early 60s that science fiction really caught on to the modernist aspirations and techniques that had been current since the 1920s. But there were people aware of that before. James Blish and Damon Knight were critics who were well-read and smart. Blish especially was a modernist and very keen on Ezra Pound, and he was obviously working within the constraints of the medium and the publishing world at the time. But his books hold up, and some of his stories are brilliant. I have for the exhibition, I have not any of his interstellar travel novels, his Cities in Flight, but I have a copy of Dr. Mirabilis, his hard science fiction novel set in the Middle Ages. It's about Roger Bacon and the invention of gunpowder, and that is the conceptual breakthrough, the discovery of the scientific method as the conceptual breakthrough. And it's fascinating, reading, and it's totally in the same vein as some of the far future sense of wonder and conceptual breakthroughs that other novelists write about.
Did you have a differentiation between fantasy and science fiction, either when you were developing or nowadays? Or you? I
really feel like they're inseparable. At one point, reviewing a book by John Clute called The Darkening Garden, I decided that it's really like a triskelion, which is or the three-legged form that is the emblem of the Isle of Man or of Sicily. Fantasy, horror, and science fiction are three, and they're three parts of the labyrinth, and they meet somewhere in the center. And it's hard to write about science fiction or to think about science fiction without mentioning the name John Clute, because he's everywhere. He's read even more books than I have, and I have a great respect and friendship for him. We don't always agree 100% on certain books, but it's great to have a give and take in a long-term conversation, and that's really where the idea for the title came from. The ReaderCon takes place every summer, but the conversations that are sparked by it go on for years, and some of them turn around and you wish, I wish I could. And of course, the friend is no longer on our mortal plane. I knew David Hartwell for nearly 20 years, again, coming into contact with him through Avram Davidson. And I bought a couple of books from him when he was selling off things with warm hands and very meaningful associations, because he was James Tiptree Jr.'s editor. Mm-hmm. And I have a book inscribed from James Tiptree and Alice Sheldon to David Hartwell. And other times I've bought them after the fact as another friend and science fiction bookseller Lloyd Curry is selling off parts of David Hartwell's library, and so I've had a few things that meaningful to me and interesting perhaps to others.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a when you have the collection all on hand as opposed to at the Grolier Club, an in case of fire route out of the house in which you grab certain things on the way, or are you just not as paranoid as I am about?
I'm going to take a pass on this question.
Understood. Because for me, it's just an arc of a Clive James poetry collection that he inscribed to me. Literally, the only thing that I would think, there's no way to replace this. I'll grab that on the way out.
Then it might be the King of Elfland's Daughter, the deluxe large paper copy in dust jacket. It's, as far as I can tell, and I would love to be proved wrong, but it's the only surviving dust jacket. The only reference in auction literature and scholarship that I found until very recently was a mention of the dust jacket in a 1953 auction catalog. As far as I know, when I asked the bibliographers about it, 20 years ago, they had never seen or even known of a copy of the dust jacket. So that's a piece of paper from 1925. It's got two drawings by Sidney Syme that are not in the book, and so that's the only thing that I know of that could not be replaced. In the collection. There are other good books and rarities, but that's the only unique artifact.
Sure. Again, I didn't mean to ask in any sort of. But
no, I'm not the worrying type.
Yeah. It's only my brother's house went up once, and that was he said, "Trust me, you won't grab anything. You will run out of the house." I was like, "Yeah, I know that, but my being insane, I still think if I just managed to grab that one little hard drive with all the podcast files on it and this and this, I'll be, but I know, just keep it all in the cloud. That's how that side of things works.
But you can't keep books in the cloud because they are objects that have passed from one hand to another.
And they're who we are. Both as a collector and as an antiquarian book dealer, how has the internet changed that stuff for you? I mean, as a comics geek, there was always that thrill of like just going to a place and seeing if they had anything, as opposed to just being able to click to buy.
I started work at A.B. Bookman's Weekly magazine in 1996. That was a time when the magazine, which had been going from the 40s, was a big, thick weekly magazine full of listings of books for sale and books wanted. Within the space of 3.5 years, it was completely irrelevant. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, the owner made some bad decisions about the internet and the impact of the internet on the book market. So that's why the magazine folded. But it changed the way people found books. So it made certain books much easier to find, and that's the woeful tale of the race to the bottom. Books that were locally scarce turn out to be printed in tens of thousands of copies. Especially take for example art, glossy art monographs. People used to want to have them because you would have the pictures. Now you can do it all on a screen, and those they were saleable. I don't know whether they are now. The thrill of the chase sometimes takes place in different ways. Even if one knows about a book, sometimes still it takes years for it to turn up, even on the even on the internet. Or I would say that it's more about being attentive to things you didn't know about.
The serendipity side of things?
Yeah, I mean, both literally in the Peter Howard serendipity books in Berkeley, and also just the timing and the right place. I could never go into serendipity books with my antiquarian bookseller's hat on, but I could always go in as a science fiction reader and prowl around and find things that had been on the shelves there for years. And I think that's where the copy of my copy of The Eternal Moment and Other Stories by E.M. Forster came from. It was up there on an upper shelf, and nobody had looked at it in 15 years. And that has the great story from 1909 or 1910, The Machine Stops, about a totally mediated world where nobody has direct contact anymore. And it's uncanny how modern and descriptive it feels of the way everybody on the subway train is now staring at their little handheld device instead of reading a newspaper or a book or staring at the crazy people across the aisle.
Or taking pictures of the crazy people across. They still do that sometimes.
Yes.
But
So in some ways there's only one market for books now, and it is the internet. It's still a distributed market all over the world, but books pop up, and I guess the other good thing about going into real bookstores is it's the thing that no algorithm will ever be able to do, and that is finding the book next to the book you thought you were looking for.
Yeah.
And really going, oh, that looks interesting. What is? And you cannot. It's impossible to find that in that kind of phenomenon in a directed, literal, search-driven form. It's very good for finding things where you know what you're looking for.
Yeah.
But I don't. And I mean, part of the interest as a reader and as a writer is what one thing will lead to, and following ideas and authors. But
in a sense, that's how this show works. I keep a mind map of where all the guests come from, like who referred me to whom, and where the nodes of people who kind of lead to a bunch of other people.
Yeah. Let's see.
Although you're a singleton, you're a guy I bumped into at the Antiquarian Book Fair and said, I remember you from ReaderCon, I think.
Yeah,
and that got us here.
In the world of books, it's usually about 1 degree of separation, not 7. But
we have a lot of common friends.
Yes.
So, yeah. Although one of them asks, where does the Henry dresses in white suits and bow ties at ReaderCon thing come from? Which I admit I'm also curious, because I'm usually the better dressed guy at these events, and you always top me at that.
Well, especially having been profiled in brief in a paragraph in the Washington Post. I mean, by another.
That would be the person who asked that question. Yeah, our friend Michael Durda.
Yes, Michael Durda, our friend, and a great reader and writer about books. ReaderCon happens in summer, and
seersucker.
Maybe since after I turned 45, I decided not to be the guy in grubby jeans, and so I put on a suit, and people see me one day a year wearing.
And that's what they think you're wearing. I was concerned.
Perfectly fine. It's just. What happens next year if I show up in a different color suit?
I once I was at a cartooning festival, and one day I did a T-shirt with a jacket and everything else, just to dress down. People literally just melted down. They had no idea how to process Gil is not wearing nice gear. It was one year. And I'm glad you're wearing the tuxedo today. I really appreciate that too, because it's
yeah. But
1 year
there is I did one year. I did take photographs of the three people wearing seersucker suit or seersucker jackets at ReaderCon. I think it was me, John Crowley, and
Straub.
Well,
we'll think about it.
We'll get. It'll come back to me.
I'm sure we'll get it in the show notes. But yeah, dressing well just to kind of. There's a reason I do it.
It's not a uniform, but it's just that. Okay, it's a public. I mean, it is a public forum, and so.
It's the face we put on. Now, when we talk about putting on faces, you mentioned going into serendipity and not being the antiquarian bookseller or book dealer. How difficult is it shifting from reader to dealer like that? Well,
it's very difficult in the world of science fiction. And anytime I'm dealing with material like that in a professional capacity, I often give whatever I'm thinking about to a colleague and say, "Would you read this?" And am I gushing? Am I unintelligible to somebody who is not in the field of science fiction and so forth? Because we all know the difference between literary merit and fame and fortune, and so you can't really. There has to be more than just one person saying so and so is a great writer for it to be collectible. But on the other hand, things sometimes I have an eye for things, and I know from my own collection how long it took me to find a copy of Swastika Night in Dust Jacket. That's the novel by Catherine Burdekin from 1937. It's the original Hitler Wins story about a far future world where the Nazis have won and women are reduced to being imprisoned as breeding animals, and their only act of resistance is to affect the birth rate. And so the secret of this empire is that no more male babies are being born. No more female babies are being born, so that this is the culture is rotten at its core. But it took me 3.5 years to 3 years to pry the copy that I have out of a London bookseller who had the Gollancz file copies. And then last summer I was at a book fair and walked into a bookseller's booth, and there was another copy of Swastika Night in Dust Jacket. This one, a presentation copy. I couldn't afford to buy it for myself, but I bought it for the shop, and I hope it'll sell soon. 3 copies in Dust Jacket known from 1937, and this one a presentation from the author to another member of the Bloomsbury intellectual set. So, so there's a little bit of overlap. I wear many hats. Science fiction is just one of the things I do at the bookshop.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I met you at the we do have the Antiquarian Book Fair coming up next month.
In March.
Yeah. In the city. I guess it's a weird question of the personal passion leading into the professional life. Was it one of those things? There's nothing else I'm really qualified for but this, or did you feel like this is just I can't believe they're paying me to do this?
No. It's work. It's work, and it's also something that it does take aptitude and knowledge of, and so it was a logical step for me to go from writing about the antiquarian world to moving into it. I knew that I could write catalog descriptions, and it's proved a good fit. I've been with James Cummins Bookseller for 17 years, and I like what I do. And interesting books keep coming in off the street and finding their way, and so come to
I've gone for the last 2 years and enjoyed the hell out of it.
Although in the Armory in March, you'll see some things that just landed on my desk on on Friday, and I'd like to be able to buy them from the people who own them, and then offer them for sale to the wider world.
Okay. I don't know how much, again, you look at it and think that would be great in my collection also, but
no, I've.
Are you still buying?
No,
at this point?
This is something a project I wanted to do. I'm sure I will buy the odd book now and then, but plenty of new books to discover and rereading. But I know for some dealer collectors, it is a very fraught topic.
Yeah. Okay. Again, I figure there's a tension or a dynamic to all that.
Well, but it's good because it does mean that one can communicate to others what it is that interests.
Yeah.
I can communicate what it is that interests me. I can recognize something else that has a story to be told about it, and try to convey that to or think of the person to whom that might be meaningful. What I love most about my job is that things come across my desk that I don't need to own everything. I
get to see
work
it
with it,
and
then it moves on to a place where it's needed, and that's great. Intellectually stimulating, and because that, and I this is something I talk a little bit about in the book, is that bibliography is not just listing books and so on. It's about really looking at what the book in front of you is. And that's that's my job description in a professional capacity. Is there something about the book that makes it interesting to someone else? And so for all that science fiction, to those of us in the field, science fiction is one thing. To people who are maybe more casual readers of it or not so closely tied in, people think of science fiction as prophecy and prediction.
Yeah.
And that's the biggest load of nonsense.
Yeah, I like to think we're past it, but we never are.
No. Because I mean, just in today's paper, I saw an example of an economist talking about William Gibson as a prophet. He would be he would be the first person to say he is not, and I think he's a great observer of the present. And that's Tom Dish once said that it's the ability to read the New York Times with a certain degree of dread and imagination, something like that, to look at what's happening right now and think, okay, this could happen, or ideas about ideas, as Joanna Russ summarized James Blish. Ideas about ideas are what is interesting, not the idea.
The idea itself, or the detail itself.
So Gibson didn't know about computers in 1982 and 3 when he was writing Neuromancer, but he had great ideas about what people who did know about them might do with it. Yeah. And so that's why the book's full of lowlifes and criminals and swindlers and extracorporeal or extraterrestrial artificial intelligence units accreting wealth and power. Yeah. I mean,
and making bricolage art.
But I really want to mention Neuromancer because
that was the book for me. I was like 13 or 14. Okay. That was the one that opened me up in SF.
It shook the ground that everybody was standing on, and it was never the same after. But to look at the first American hardcover edition of Neuromancer is what bibliography is all about. It's a great book, but the cover,
garish.
It's a beautiful cover. Really fantastic painting. So post-punk, post-Bowie, sort of neon noir, great garish colors. This guy, this very suspect-looking guy with a big, long, portable keyboard that is, obviously computer and keyboard all in one. Even clunkier than what was those portable HP?
Oh God, portable because it had a handle on it. But that was.
But then on the back cover, there's a girl with electronic eyes, and she is leaning against a telephone booth, and nothing says 21st century more than telephone booth. In 1986, maybe.
Yeah.
Who knew that there was not going to be telephone booths?
I'm telling you, though, I feel the same way. But Kyle Cassidy, the photographer, pointed out to me, they're everywhere. They're still everywhere in New York. Every block you go on, there's actually still a payphone. And until he told me that, I never noticed. No, seriously, because I told him there was one on 11th Avenue behind, or 12th, behind the Javits Center. Yeah. He said, no, Gil, trust me, just open your eyes when you're walking down the street. And all of a sudden, I started seeing them everywhere. So they do still exist. But no, I get your point that there was such an antiquated thing to have right in the middle of that future.
Except in 1986, when that book was printed, and that artist was working and displaying his ideas of what science fiction was. Of course, the telephone booths had always been around. They were always going to be around. And then along came this thing called the cell phone. And but no, so I mean, Catherine Burdick writing Swastika Night in 1936 and published in 1937, she was not predicting the future. She had clearly paid attention to the rhetoric and style and impulse of the Nazi world that was unfolding in front of her. She knew people who had come out of artists and other people who had come out of it. And she was observing the present and thinking, well, this is where it's going to be. And that's why that book is still so powerful and so resonant, because it's not about prediction. It's about looking at what's going on. And so it's always still relevant to us now. I mean, some of the older books, the writing might be a little clunky by modern standards, but they're still worth thinking about. And I'm always interested in where things come from, or precursors for things and how things evolve.
And it's a genre where that's part of the impact of Gibson and the cyberpunk guys who came out in that same circle. To me, is like a late teen once Mirror Shades comes out, and they're all talking about their influences, which opens me up to Ballard and to those new wave guys, to Chip and Dish and people like that. That there was a sense of awareness of their own history.
Oh, absolutely. But even even William Burroughs is an author whom Gibson esteems very highly. But William Burroughs was aware of science fiction and paperbacks, because those three novels in the early 60s after Naked Lunch, Nova Express, The Soft Machine, The Ticket Exploded, they're all playing with science fiction ideas. So as Gibson wrote in The Peripheral, information flows both ways. So it's not just that that the mainstream literature or modernist literature finally makes its way into science fiction. It's also that science fiction goes into the modernist mainstream literature. Allen Ginsberg was instrumental in getting William Burroughs' first book, Junkie, published as an ace double, not as a science fiction double, as an ace crime double. But that's right in the same milieu that so of course Burroughs knew science fiction tropes from what he was reading.
From the collection, from the exhibition, unsung book or author that you would really want everybody to pick up on, or is Avram Davidson the?
No, there's several. I mean,
like your unappreciated fave. Is there someone you've got who?
I think that Greer Gilman is a great writer. Really does things with language that are just pure magic. And I would love to see her work gain a wider audience. And then a favorite of mine is The Secret Service by Wendy Walker. It is a fantasy novel set in a maybe late 19th century alternate world. There are kings and queens in Europe. There's electricity, but there's this strange technology that the Secret Service of the title have learned that allows people to transform themselves into objects. Mm-hmm. And the brilliant part of the book is that Wendy Walker has the spies experience the world as the object they have been transformed in. One is turned into a crystal goblet. Just so the sensory imagery and the brilliance of the prose are fascinating. The other is a bronze statue, and the third is a rose. And so you get all sorts of sensory input. There's an intrigue, and there's sort of a fantasy novel of a young woman imprisoned in a tower within the novel. And it was published in 1992 or 93, and it has never seen as wide an audience as it should. And it's not too dissimilar to work by someone like Ellen Kushner in what I guess they called for a time the fantasy of manners. Except that Wendy is a really brilliant writer and the book interrogates a lot of the tropes that she's playing with. What it means to have a crazed German collector of porcelain trying to turn himself and the young woman he's got imprisoned in a tower into porcelain objects. So that they don't no longer feel. I mean, the funny thing is that, let's see, The Venetian Glass Nephew from Eleanor Wiley's novel from the 1920s touches on some of these. Wendy told me that she had never read that book, but clearly she and Eleanor Wiley must have read the same sources, Casanova, and thinking about the position of women in society.
Gotcha. Last question, and it comes from Liz Hand. One book you don't have that you wish you did? Real. She actually said real or unreal, but I think if you go unreal, you're going to come up with something really off the wall.
I want to read Liz Hand's next two books.
The Castaneries?
But I want to talk about one more real book that is worthy of rediscovery. There is no good modern edition of Phantasmion by Sarah Coleridge. That's the daughter of Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And she wrote the first fairy tale novel in English in a secondary world. It's not like the Arabian Nights where Sinbad's voyages start in the known world and go off into the fantastic. This is completely a secondary world. There's no good edition. There are a couple of terrible, badly, unedited computer OCR things published as paperbacks. I would love to see a new edition of that people could find her place, bring her back into prominence, because she is in the generation slightly, I guess, a little older than maybe about the same age as Mary Shelley, but sort of the bridge between Mary Shelley and Frankenstein, and then the later 19th century novels. A book that I wish I had. I would really, really love to have a copy of the original Frankenstein, 1818, in the blue or the drab paper boards as it was published in 3 volumes. What I have in the collection is the first American edition from 1833, which is a great book. It's the same text, but that's I could swap my house for that.
Right.
And so I'm not going to. But I want to read the next books I want to have the next books from all of my friends to add to my shelves. Those are the books that don't yet exist that I would like to have.
Sounds like a good note to leave off on. Henry, thanks so much for coming on the Virtual Memories Show.
Okay. Thank you for having me.
And that was Henry Wessells. His main website is The Endless Bookshelf at endlessbookshelf.net, which is spelled like it sounds. He's also on Twitter as endless_bookshelf, which is ENDLESS_BKSHELF. His new book, which is what this is really all about, is A Conversation Larger Than the Universe, Readings in Science Fiction and the Fantastic. It's published by Oak Knoll, and it accompanies his amazing exhibition at the Grolier Club in New York City, which is Park Avenue and 60th. If you're into science fiction, and as we determined, that includes fantasy and horror, and you're anywhere in the area, you owe it to yourself to come see this exhibition. Look up the Grolier Club hours first, but come see it. It's really just a wonder to see this collection and to understand what these works mean to Henry and what they say about who we are. Now, the exhibition is going to be running until March 10th, 2018. Henry is going to be giving lunchtime exhibition tours from 1 to 2 p.m. on February 22nd, March 1st, and March 7th. And again, that's 2018 for those of you living in the future. There's also going to be a panel discussion on science fiction on March 6th from 6 o'clock to 7:30 next to the Grolier Club at the Parish Hall of Christ Church. It's 524 Park Avenue. You'll need to RSVP for that, so call the Grolier Club admin at 212-838-6690 if you want to attend. The panelists, besides Henry, are some of my favorite past podcasts, including Ellen Datlow, John Crowley, and Samuel Delaney, as well as a bunch of other science fiction luminaries. The club's website, I should have given you that earlier, is grolierclub.org. GROLIERCLUB.org. Go there. It's a really neat club anyway, although they're about to do renovation on the first floor. Henry's exhibition is on the second floor. Go there. It's really wonderful. Now, once we wrapped up the main session, I asked Henry, so, besides John Crowley, who are you reading? If you want to hear his answer to that, you'll need to become a supporter of the Virtual Memories Show so you can get access to our quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet. The newest episode of that one just went up this week, and it features new material from Shannon Wheeler, Barry Blitt, Martin Rosen, Nicholas Delbanco, Eshkol Nevo, Paul Gravett, Eddie Portnoy, Vanda Kreft, and Cullen Murphy. Now, you can support the Virtual Memories Show via patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod. I've got all sorts of goals and goodies in place for patrons, including that podcast, patron-only blog, handwritten show notes for every episode. My new secret project, which I will tell you right now, even though I know nobody's listening at this point in the show, is a zine. It is a small chapbook sort of thing of my writing and a little photography, transcripts of past episodes, and it's something I want to do regularly, and I'm going to start making it and giving it to supporters of the show, and there's a whole lot of reasons for that I'll get into some other time. Anyway, go to patreon.com/VMSpod and support the art of fine conversation. Now, I recorded this one at Henry's home in suburban New Jersey, so it was just gas money this time around. If you want to help defray some of the costs of the Virtual Memories Show, like web hosting, travel, equipment, coffee, or just toss me some money because you think the show is worth it, then visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and make a one-time or recurring donation. Now, special thanks go out to John Wendler, Fred Kish, Jonathan Kranz, Stephen Nadler, Wallace Wilde Minozzi, Noah Van Sciver, Andrew Mason, Greg Tanner, Garrett Zecker, Craig P. Steffen, Jack Lescamella, Joe Caruso, Paul Karasik, and Michael Janizik for going over and above in their support of the Virtual Memories show. We have a full list of show supporters at chimeraobscura.com/VM. Our music for this episode is Nothing's Gonna Bring Me Down by David Bayerwald, used with permission from the artist. And that's it for this week's Virtual Memories show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with the cartoonist Lauren Weinstein. She's the person I recorded with on Sunday who did not, in fact, need to use the bathroom in my house. Although, like I say, at least I have a nice clean bathroom now. Anyway, till then, you can subscribe to the Virtual Memories show and download past episodes at the iTunes store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at facebook.com/virtualmemoriesshow, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube by searching for Virtual Memories. We're also on tunein.com, where you could search for Virtual Memories Show or Gil Roth. And if you like this show, please go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories show, and leave a rating and review for us. That'll help us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you are awesome. Keep it that way.